Do statins cause diabetes? I get this question pretty much every single day on my social media posts. It seems like everybody's like, don't take statins, they cause diabetes. Don't take this, diabetes, sugar this, sugar that. So look, once and for all, I'm going to answer this question. First, I highly recommend you go watch my other video that I posted on this topic called Sugar, or Does Sugar Cause Heart Disease? Because it seems like people have these weird theories that sugar causes heart disease, and it's not the cholesterol, it's not the fat, which is obviously insane, and no one in the medical community follows that. Now, if you follow one of these weird conspiracy theories, this video is not for you. This is for people who are in the medical community and scientific community and like to follow evidence-based research. Now, I'm Dr. Alo. I'm a board-certified cardiologist, double board-certified cardiologist. I wrote the book on cholesterol. If you click on my links or go to dralo.net/cholesterol, that's dralo.net/cholesterol, you can find out how to get that book. Now, this is a very nuanced topic, and anybody who tells you, yes, statins cause diabetes, or no, statins don't cause diabetes, is probably lying to you or just doesn't understand the topic well enough. So if you really want to understand diabetes and the role that sugar plays and the role that cholesterol plays and heart disease and all that, this is definitely the video for you, because we're going to dive a little bit deep. I'm going to break this up into two parts. First part is basically me talking kind of in general to like the average person. And then if you're really data driven and you want the details, we'll go into the data and the studies on the diabetes, blood sugar, exact, statin versus blood sugar and diabetes studies, and we'll get into a little bit more depth. So first of all, I want to back way up. Type 2 diabetes is a genetic disorder. If you haven't watched some of my videos on that, go watch them. There are 17 alleles, and maybe I'll put them up here. There are 17 alleles that we know of that give you insulin resistance. Now, type 2 diabetes is a spectrum. You start out mildly insulin resistant, you're a little more insulin resistant, a little more insulin resistant, a little more, you become pre-diabetic, and then ultimately you become diabetic. Now, there are lots of different ways to measure people along this spectrum. The fact that type 2 diabetes is genetic means that one of your parents had it. Either your mom or your dad gave it to you. Now you might say, well, none of my parents were diabetic. How come I am? Well, they might have had a mild case of it. They stayed at a pretty ideal body weight, or not, big enough. They haven't gained a lot of weight. So it never really manifested. Or their A1C was like 5.5, 5.7, never really full-blown diabetic. And they lived a long, healthy life, which is totally fine. That can happen. So it is a spectrum, and you can define that spectrum however you want. You can use A1C, which is glycosylated hemoglobin. When you get to 5.7, you are considered pre-diabetic. Above 6.5, and you are actually diabetic. Now, if you are 5.5 or 5.6, that doesn't mean you're not diabetic at all, or you don't have any insulin resistance. Sure, you do. Because people who are non-diabetic whatsoever and don't have the genes for it, their A1C is like 4.4, 4.2, 4.6. They are well under 5. So if you're above 5, the closer you are to that 5.7 mark, the more insulin resistance you have. This is not like debatable. This is an established fact in medicine. There are other ways to measure diabetes. We can use fasting glucoses. A fasting glucose in most people who are completely non-diabetic whatsoever ranges somewhere between 65 up to maybe 80. Generally, most people are between 70 and 80 if you are completely not diabetic, right? The closer you get to 100, the more insulin resistant you are. And then once you hit 100, we say you are pre-diabetic. And once you hit 126, or above 125 and higher, then you are diabetic. You can also do oral glucose tolerance tests. You can do euglycemic clamps, which are super invasive. Nobody recommends that, but it is the gold standard. You can check sometimes free insulin and compare it to your fasting glucose. That's something. And there's another test called the HOMA-IR. There's another test called the NMR, lipoprotein rating, where they look at various metrics in your lipoproteins and use NMR technology to figure out how insulin resistant you are. You're on a scale from 0 to 100. The closer to 100, the more insulin resistant you are. So let's put that aside. Now the question becomes, why does knowing if someone's insulin resistant or diabetic matter? Well, first of all, because we need to institute ways to fix this. Now, Obviously, when you go see your doctor, number one thing they're going to tell you is diet and exercise. And it doesn't even matter what diet you select, as long as you pick a diet that puts you in a calorie deficit that you enjoy or can stick to, or doesn't feel that restrictive to you, you will definitely lose weight. Now, there are some diets and some people will raise their LDL cholesterol, ketogenic, high saturated fat style diets, lots of red meat, carnivore type stuff. That will generally, for most people, raise their cholesterol. And while you may say, well, I'm only going to do it for a few months to lower my body fat percentage, my body weight, and then get back onto a more balanced diet, that's probably okay. But generally speaking, you do not want to be exposed to high LDL cholesterol over a long enough time horizon. You can watch some of my videos on cholesterol. There's a whole cholesterol playlist. In fact, this video will be in that playlist. But there's a playlist called Cholesterol and Lipids on my YouTube channel. So if you're listening to the audio version of this, most of the audios are in here, on the podcast. But if you want to watch the video, go to drallo.tv, dralo.tv, and find the playlist and go to the one called Cholesterol and Lipids. You will have a very in-depth understanding of the current knowledge up to today, regarding cholesterol, lipoproteins, lipids, risk, how to modify your risk, how to live longer, how to be healthier, etc. So I'll recommend you do that if you want like a super deep dive into all things cholesterol. So back to where we were. So those are all the different ways of checking insulin resistance. You can check it in a multitude of different ways. Generally speaking, when I'm seeing a patient, you can just look at a few basic labs and pretty much tell if they're insulin resistant or not. You could look at their A1Cs, their fasting glucoses, their triglycerides sometimes, various metrics, and you can tell if they are insulin resistant. And the reason we care about this is because people with insulin resistance, and especially once it's full-blown diabetes, but generally insulin resistance is a spectrum, and as it increases and gets worse, your risk of heart disease goes up. Now, you have to have a baseline of elevated LDL cholesterol over a long enough time horizon. So a 20-year-old with a LDL cholesterol of 120 and is now diabetic, not going to be that risky. However, you ignore that 20-year-old, you let that LDL of 120 go on for 30 years, and that insulin resistance gets worse over those 30 years, now you have a very serious problem. We've always looked at cholesterol in sometimes chunks of 30 years, not always, but sometimes, a recent opinion piece was published where they said if you had to choose 30 years of your life to keep your LDL cholesterol down, would you rather it be the 30 years between 20 and 50 or the 30 years between 50 and 80? 100% you'd rather it be the earlier years, because by the time you're 50, which is when most people get put on cholesterol meds, you already have plaque, you have soft plaque, you have tons of plaque, and it's just impossible to reverse that and get rid of it. But if at age 20, you no longer have plaque and you've blocked the progression of plaque, you are not going to have problems when you're 40, 50, 70, 80, and you're probably going to live a lot longer. We know based on multitudes of studies, and I've talked about it in other videos, you can watch them, LDL cholesterol over about 60 milligrams per deciliter, and most people are laying down plaque. We know this from the Jupiter trial and multitudes of other trials now. But the Jupiter trial was the first one to show. But 57 and lower, we generally did not see atherosclerosis. The other way you could do it is multiply your LDL cholesterol by your age. So you take a 40-year-old person, their LDL cholesterol is 125, multiply it, that's 5,000. That's called 5,000 milligram years. You have 5,000 milligrams of cholesterol for those many years, for those 40 years that you were alive. So when you're above 5,000, you absolutely have plaque and you are at increased risk. So if you are below 2,000, your risk is incredibly low. Between those numbers, you have risk. It's just not as high as the 5,000. And then some people have like 10,000. So that is another way to do it. Multiply your LDL by your age, and that gives you your risk. Or if you've known for the majority of your life that your LDL has been above 60, you probably have plaque. It just takes decades to go on. So we do not want to ignore young people who are like, well, my LDL is only 105 and I'm only 20 years old. My fasting glucose is now 110, 109. That is a problem. And unfortunately, I see way too many physicians and, primary care practitioners, even cardiologists, that just ignore these. They got people who are diabetic, pre-diabetic, insulin resistant, not yet diabetic, but we keep ignoring them for decades. That is wrong. The longer you ignore these people, the more plaque they can build up and the worse their outcomes are going to be long term. Our job should be prevention. That's why I'm a preventative cardiologist and I teach these videos to prevent cardiology. I do not want to have you be my patient because you absolutely have to. I want you to be my patient because you need me. And we can work on things at that point in time, but I'd rather you never have to see me ever. My patients always say to me, Dr. Alo, I wish I would have met you 40 years ago. Well, this is your chance. Let's say you're 20 years old and you're watching this, or 30 even, and you want to never need a cardiologist. This is the kind of stuff you should be watching, and this is the kind of stuff you should be listening to. Ignore all the online idiots that are like, sugar causes heart disease, statins cause diabetes, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you can go listen to those idiots if you want to, but that will be very detrimental to your health and your lifespan, your health span. You'll end up with multiple heart attacks, strokes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and whatnot. So let's get back to, do statins themselves cause diabetes? So if you just listen to what I said, you'll realize that diabetes is actually a genetic disorder. No medication can give you diabetes. However, there are medications that have a slight diabetogenic effect. And these are medications that we commonly take. There are a lot of medications that people take that are quite diabetogenic, but no one cares because they're not been vilified in the media like statins. It seems like people love to blame everything on statins. Solar eclipse, statins. World War III, statins. Nuclear bombs, statins. So it's unfortunate that, it's kind of cool to hate on statins when these medications literally have probably saved millions and millions of lives, because until we had statins, we had almost no way of really lowering people's LDL cholesterol. And now we do. And for those of you who don't know, statins actually come from nature. They come from a little molecule in yeast, and that's how we invented them. Now, the yeast in and of itself has other toxins that can kill your kidneys and do other things, which is why we needed to purify the molecule so that it can be controlled and dosed appropriately. And that's how we came up with statins. The most recent one is Crestor. It is a synthetic statin. With every generation of a medication, usually have less side effects, less interactions, and more potency at lower doses. Crestor, even at a tiny dose, is quite potent compared to the previous generations. So speaking of Crestor, let's get to the first study. The most important study, I think, so just back up a little more. So if you realize that statins are if you realize that diabetes is genetic, then you realize that a medication can't change your genes. We do not have ways of altering your genes yet. We do now. There's something called mRNA silencing and stuff like that, or CRISPR technology. Haven't gotten into that really. But for now, there's not really a good way to modify your genes. I cannot give you diabetes. That's just not possible. So what happens is, you take these medications that are slightly diabetogenic. People who have insulin resistance already that are maybe not yet, counted as diabetic because their A1C is 6.4. Now they start taking Crestor and boom, their A1C is 6.5. Now they are diabetic. For those of you who are diabetic and you know that a 0.1 percent change in your A1C is not the end of the world. However, the risk reduction you get from lowering your LDL cholesterol, say from, let's say it was 130 and you're 6.4 on your A1C, now you're 6.5, but you crushed your LDL down to 60 or 70, which diabetics, we want them under 70, then you have a much better risk profile. Sure, your A1C got a little worse. There are things you can do. You can actually lose weight. You can actually, optimize your medications, take some of the newer diabetes medications instead of some of these older ones that, may not really help you. There are so many things we can do. This is not a diabetes lecture per se, but generally speaking, diabetics should first try weight loss. Like I said earlier, the first thing is weight loss. If you're overweight, you got to lose weight. That gives you generally not just benefits in terms of your insulin resistance, but benefits in terms of outcomes. You're healthier, you're more fit, you can do more, your cardiovascular system is healthier. The second thing would be to add medications if needed. Every diabetic should be on metformin, and if that's not enough, they should be on SGLT2. These are like your Jardiance and Farxigas. If that's not enough, then you can add some of the GLPs. These are like the Ozempics, Mounjaros, Trulicities, Victoza, Bydureon, Byetta, those kind of medications. That combination will not only cause weight loss because the SGLT2s almost, they make you pee out sugar, basically, pee out calories. And the Ozempic and whatnot, the GLPs make you not eat calories. So there's a benefit there. But a lot of these things help you in your insulin resistance and processing. Metformin, for example, improves insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity, makes you poop out sugar and carbs, and prevents gluconeogenesis in your liver. Your liver doesn't produce as much excess sugar. So using some of the older medications is not as beneficial. But like I said, it's not really supposed to be a diabetes lecture, but that's just like a little brief kind of overview for diabetes. Let's say the person's diabetes is completely optimized now. They're put on Crestor and their A1C went from 6.4 to 6.5, and now all of a sudden they're diabetic. Or they were 5.6 and now they're 5.7, and now they are pre-diabetes. All of the studies that have shown that when you put people on statins, and I'll go through some of the studies in a little bit, but when you put people on statins, they have a slight increase in their A1C, which could potentially put them over the edge from one group to another. Let's say you were told, you're not diabetic. You're not diabetic at all. Your A1C is 5.6. All of a sudden, you're on rosuvastatin 20, which was exactly the Jupiter trial. Rosuvastatin 20, your A1C goes up to 5.7 from 5.6, and now you are quote unquote pre-diabetic. And your doctor says, "Oh my God, you're pre-diabetic." Like, "Oh, damn it, it was the statin." Well, yes, but that's not a problem. At least your doctor finally now told you that you have insulin resistance, and now you can actually take steps towards improving that. That is what we want. So you can start losing weight. You can pick up an exercise program, start lifting weights. Putting on muscle definitely helps. Eating a different diet, switching over to a more Mediterranean style diet, because saturated fat and red meat actually increases insulin resistance. This is not, debatable really in the scientific community. All of these things you can start instituting. Weight comes off, your numbers get better, your LDL probably goes down if you cut out saturated fat. All of these things improve and your risk goes down. Now, the reason I said we care is because diabetes does impart higher risk to atherosclerosis. If you have a high ApoB or a high LDL cholesterol, you will develop atherosclerosis. If you are diabetic, you develop it faster. Not because of any magical powers of being diabetic, but because your ApoB actually goes up. Your LDL cholesterol actually increases. There is more cholesterol in your lipoproteins and more lipoproteins in circulation because you are not getting them out of circulation fast enough. So your LDL cholesterol goes up, and it goes up, quite significantly. And that is why you have more heart disease in diabetics. So I hope that helps. If you are a person that just kind of wants the basics, those are the basics of how statins may or may not affect your blood sugars. Oh, and the other diabetic, the pro-diabetic or diabetogenic medications, these are ones that people don't care about at all. Beta blockers, for example. People take beta blockers, they're diabetogenic. People take hydrochlorothiazide, water pill, blood pressure medication, also pro-diabetogenic. People take steroids, whether it's inhalers or pills sometimes, for various autoimmune, asthma-style diseases, COPD, what have you, also diabetogenic. There's some of the antidepressants that are also diabetogenic, other than their weight-gaining effects. Some of them cause weight gain, which if you already have the genes for diabetes, that will happen. Weight gain in and of itself increases diabetes. A lot of people, once they start taking statin medications, they go a little looser on their diet, they start eating a little more, they gain weight, and that puts them over the edge for being diabetic. So if you were kind of just wanted a basic overview, that's the basic overview. For those of you who want more, I'm going to dive into some of these studies that have a little bit more detail and nuance. So like I said, the very first one was that Jupiter trial where they put people on rosuvastatin 20 milligrams, and the A1C in that group went up from 5.8% to 5.9%. And this study was on people with inflammation, high inflammation. I think CRP cutoff was like 2.0 or something, or maybe 3, I don't remember. And they had high inflammation and an LDL at the time that was considered normal. I think it was like 100, 110 maybe. And they dropped them down below 70. Some of the people in that trial got below 57. And those are the ones that had no atherosclerosis. So we know from even back then, I think it was 2001, maybe 2004, even back then, we knew below 57, there was no atherosclerosis in your LDL cholesterol in milligrams per deciliter. So that was one of the first studies. Another thing we found from the Jupiter trial is that the number needed to treat for the various vascular endpoints was super low. I mean, we're talking, depending on if you look at the 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, and 5-year numbers to treat, you had numbers in the as high as 95 and as low as 25. So some of the outcomes, all you had to do is treat 25 people in that cohort to prevent one stroke, prevent one heart attack, prevent one cardiovascular death, to reduce all-cause mortality, any death from any cause even. All of those were, in super low numbers needed to treat. Now, the trial had to be stopped early because it was unethical to continue the placebo arm because the people in the placebo arm had a tremendous amount of event rates versus the people in the treatment arm. So a lot of times studies will be stopped early when you see that. And so they won't be powered for certain endpoints. Like if you're trying to power for all-cause mortality, you're just not going to be able to with a very short study and a low number of participants. You're going to have like maybe one death. If you have like 80 participants and you just follow them for a few years, 2 years, 1 year, 5 year, you're not going to be able to power for all-cause mortality. It's just a bunch of nonsense. Anybody who says that doesn't understand statistics and the power, of statistics. But they had enough people in the study. There was a lot of people. I forget the exact number, but it was enough people where you could determine all of those numbers needed to treat. Now, some of the numbers needed to treat in the Jupiter trial with that statin dose did have much lower numbers to treat than blood pressure meds. Some of the blood pressure meds have NNTs of like 300 or 250 or 280 or 180. So this medication, statin medications, have much, much lower numbers needed to treat. And if you grab my cholesterol book at drallo.net/cholesterol, one of the studies in there is where they looked at all comers, every study that's ever been done on statins, and they looked at what is the lowest number needed to treat, and they found that it was 7. For every 7 people on statin therapy, you had a reduction. I forget which endpoint it was, but I believe it was cardiovascular events. You prevented one heart attack, for example. So they had an NNT of 7, which prevented one heart attack. Maybe it was a stroke, maybe it was cardiovascular death, what have you. But generally, death takes a little bit more. But for every 7 people that are on statins, you would reduce one cardiovascular event, whether it's revascularization, meaning requiring new stents after already having stents, or new open heart surgery after already having stents, a new revascularization, peripheral artery disease, atherosclerosis, stroke, stroke from your neck, veins into your head, etc. Though that was a pretty remarkable study, and it's in the cholesterol book. You can grab it at drallo.net/cholesterol. That was a study. Another study that was recently published comparing the long-term efficacy and safety of rosuvastatin versus atorvastatin in adults with coronary artery disease demonstrated that the rosuvastatin group had a higher incidence of new-onset diabetes requiring initiation of anti-diabetes medication. This is the one that I was kind of talking about earlier. The absolute difference, though, between the two groups was 1.8%. So this was a group that looked at atorvastatin versus rosuvastatin. The difference between the two is 1.8%. You had a 9.5% versus a 7.7% on the other group. So still, there was a slight increase with the more potent statin, obviously atorvastatin, towards diabetes. But again, this was in people that already had insulin resistance and already had diabetes. So another study, let's go to this one. A recent article published in Circulation showed that people on atorvastatin 40 for 10 weeks had a 7 to 9% increase in most diabetes-related markers. This would include people who have insulin resistance and prediabetes that do not yet fall into the diabetes category. For diabetics, this would mean that their diabetes will worsen by about 7%. Now, a 7% increase in your A1C, let's say you're like at 6.5%, a 7% increase is not that much. It probably won't even get you to 7. So still, slight increase, but the amount of risk reduction you would get from being on statin, we know that for every 1 millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol, you get about a 22 to 26% reduction in risk. And 1 millimole in American is 38.6 milligrams per deciliter. So for every 38 milligrams per deciliter reduction in LDL cholesterol, you get a 22 to maybe 26% reduction in various cardiovascular event rates, markers, heart attacks, strokes, etc. So even though you get like a minimal bump in your A1C, you're getting a 22 to 26% reduction, maybe more if we lower your LDL cholesterol by 2 millimoles or more in your risk of cardiovascular events. So that's obviously very impressive. The study, that same study also showed that using an oral glucose tolerance test, however, showed only a 0.05% increase in the area under the curve. So these are the people like would drink glucose or, do the oral glucose tolerance test. They look at the area under the curve as your blood sugar rises and falls. They had a 0.05 increase, which is minimal. Minuscule. It's not really anything at all. So one thing I will like to reiterate again, obviously, and I'm sure I kind of said it already, the European Atherosclerotic Society, the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, the endocrine societies, every society recommends lower LDL cholesterols for diabetics for a reason. The totality of evidence shows that if you are diabetic, you need your LDL cholesterol, even if you're like super young and healthy, 20 years old, diabetic, nothing else going on, you need your LDL under 70. And I'm sure as time goes on, they might even lower those numbers further. That is, once you've had a heart attack or a stroke, then obviously we need you under 55, whether you're diabetic or not. But generally speaking, young, average, healthy person, no issues other than diabetes, or let's say pre-diabetes, insulin resistance, whatever you want to call it, they need their LDLs under 70. And we got to be super aggressive about it, because otherwise you are tearing up these people's arteries if you don't treat it or you kind of let it go. In another study that included over 700,000 participants, those taking statins saw a 7.9% increase in diabetes medication intensification, but no new incidence of diabetes. So this was almost 1 million people, 700,000. They needed slightly more diabetes medications, but there was no new people that were now suddenly called diabetic that were not previously. Another study that was published in The Lancet in March of 2024, super recent, looked at about 123,000 people on statin that were on statins for at least 4.9 years, about 5 years. And they found that non-diabetics went on to develop diabetes 10 to 36% of the time, depending on how intense the statin dose was that was being used versus placebo. For example, they found that low-dose statin users went on to develop diabetes at a rate of 1.3% per year versus the placebo group, which went on to develop diabetes at a rate of 1.2% per year, which is obviously not a lot. It's quite low. Again, you're looking at a 0.1% difference. Further, the non-diabetics that went on to develop diabetes were those who had borderline glycemic markers that are close to the diagnostic threshold for diabetes. And that is an exact quote. These were baseline glycemic markers that are close to the diagnostic threshold for diabetes. So again, this data points to the fact where if you're already diabetic, you're already insulin resistant, and you are on the border or the threshold of being diabetic or pre-diabetic or what have you, you would be one of these people that would go on to progress to a slightly worsening insulin resistance. Again, this shows that it's not giving people diabetes that don't already have the genes for it. And I think that's it for the studies part. So those of you who want the studies and want the details and the live links to the studies, go to my cholesterol book. That's drallo.net/cholesterol, and you can grab it there. So hopefully this clears up a lot of misconceptions. If you like this kind of stuff, join my community. We talk about this literally day and night. You can text me, chat with me all day and night through the app. And we have weekly live Zooms. You can join my live Zooms. They're Monday nights. If you go to drallo.net/community, you can join. If you use the code 1month, 1MONTH, all caps, 1 is a number, the number 1 MONTH. You can join my community for free the first month. See if you like it. If you don't, no one cares. Just cancel. No one will be mad. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you in the next episode.